Okay, so we're going to move into the concept of servant leadership. And servant leadership is not new to most of us when we start to explore these concepts. But in the management sciences, those folks that are out there either making a living in corporate America or small businesses, or who are advocating leadership effectiveness in leadership principles, the concept of servant leadership is relatively new in modern time, and it's gaining substantial support from theologians and management and leadership specialists as the most effective way to lead. And that's whether you're leading an organization like a corporation. In fact, there are now many Christian business organizations that are gathering leaders together to apply these principles. Whether you're leading at the corporate scene, whether you're leading a small business, whether you're leading in a home or in your church. This model is, in fact, in the last chapter of my book, I lay down some basic premises that actually show that if you lead by following, lead by serving, you will actually improve the top line growth and bottom line performance of a company. And my advisor said, man, I'm not sure you should put that in your thesis, and I did. And after he and several others read it, they said, man, you got to explore these ideas. And it really comes down to the quality of the results of the group, whether it's a church, a community, a home, or a corporation. In this case, I looked at corporations. The quality of the individuals, the passion they have for their purpose, the integrity they exhibit in their work, all translates into customers wanting to be with them and wanting to be there as opposed to anywhere else. And then if they're always looking to serve, they're going to always be plugged into what those customers really need. And so it's very logical that God would design the model for the marketplace. It would make us most effective in the world, and in this case, an organizational type application. So servant leadership is not a new concept, but it's relatively new in modern management science. And what we're really looking at is our inward response. We're going to talk a little bit about how we engage outward, but we're really talking about the transformation that occurs within. And we're taking the principles that Martin's been talking about up to this point. We're saying, how does that translate into how I see myself, my relationship with God, how I'm transformed spiritually and emotionally and mentally, and how that changes the way I look to others. And I basically say we lead by serving. So we're going to remind you of the model as an overview, talk about who we are as leaders and how we define ourselves. Then I want to spend some time looking at Peter. Peter is by far my favorite disciple because I just relate so much to him and all his failings and all the struggles he had to finally become the leader of God's church. All that struggle that he went through and the transformation that went on in his intimate relationship with Christ. It's just, to me, I can relate to the humanness of Peter. And then we'll talk about what it means to be a transformed leader and then finish with that inward response to his call. So we've talked about this model, basically how to translate our faith into action and align our work activities with God's purpose. What we're really going to do today is focus on this inward transformation that occurs in the context of what I call the cycle of renewal. Next week we'll begin to look at how we engage community in that process. So let's talk about the concept of lead by serving. Martin, I believe, has used this a couple times in our studies. This verse to me hits the nail on the head. If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. This is the part that I want to highlight this morning, and that is, what good is it for a man to gain the whole world yet forfeit his soul? When we move out into the marketplace and we've got to do our day-to-day job, largely we're focused on making a living. And as we move into the concept of leadership, whether it's on the job or whether it's in those other community settings, we really have to keep in mind what our core purpose is. If we're motivated, we're going to talk about motivated by worldly standards, if we're motivated out of the world, motivated out of the flesh, we can get caught up in this concept of leadership and all the worldly praise that comes with it, and the measurable results that come with it, whether it's dollars in the coffer at a company, whether it's, you know, amazing work that goes on in the church. All of those things can turn us inward and towards self if we're not careful. So I really took to heart this part of, you know, in verse 38, what good is it for a man to gain the whole world yet forfeit his soul? As a leader in corporate sense, I was on that track. And so we're going to talk about how to avoid those pitfalls. So our first step needs to be to deny self. We've been talking about that at length. We assume the posture of a servant, the upward gaze, and understanding what it means to serve others, to serve God, and to serve community. The inward transformation really needs to start at what we call the heart, you know, our heart and soul. And we talked about this in terms of the mind and the spirit. Basically, Paul talks about the you know, be transformed by the renewal of your mind. It starts with denying self, and it really becomes a state of mind leading to this posture of a servant. We need to take our eyes off of ourselves in this world, focus on Him, and then ultimately turn towards others in our posture of serving. I'm going to talk today about this idea of continuous spiritual and mental renewal that Martin's been talking about, and I'm going to present a model that I call the cycle of renewal that allows us to engage where we are in our spiritual and mental health and well-being, and then take some kind of a spiritual and mental inventory of where we need to go and where God's leading us. It starts with living in His presence. We talked about that in the last couple of weeks, living there every hour, every minute by minute. It's really tough if you're going to do this as a practice makes perfect. If I try to exhibit Christ-likeness simply by my willpower, we know how frustrating that can be, right? The first time you make a mistake, the first time you allow your flesh to engage, that's not Christ-likeness. So it really has to be deep down, transformational change in the heart. The things that we spend our tape loops in our mind, right? And replace that, supplant that with the Holy Spirit engaging us, informing us, and guiding us in our daily walk. So I want you to kind of ask yourself a few simple questions in terms of taking this first step. Basically a self-examination. We're not going to talk about this, I just want you to contemplate these questions. How do I define myself? How do I view my role at work, home, church, and community? And then, is success a motivator in my life? And then how do I define success? If your expectations of worldly success become the primary motivators of your life, then there's this gap, and Martin talked about this, I'm going to show the model again, a gap between the expectations and our daily experiences. Basically, we set expectations for success, and if those metrics are worldly metrics, and our expectations drive our behavior, we were just talking a little bit about that this morning, we constantly live in this gap between I failed and God had a purpose in mind. And sometimes we don't discover that purpose until we live in that gap for a while. But we go through this cycle of frustration if we're trying to do this on our own willpower, motivated out of worldly metrics. I want to get a more secure job, I want to make more money, I want to get a better house, whatever. Those things, if those are at the root of what drives us and how we measure success, we're guaranteed to be disappointed. Because good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
Good, sorry.
That's great. Glad you're here. If those become the underlying metrics, the world is fleeting. And so if we're not motivated out of that core relationship that we form by that minute by minute, continuing to live in the presence, then we're wrought for failure. So we talked last week about understanding our purposes and understanding our core gifts. One of the reasons I advocate for that type of thinking and really exploring your core gifts is that I believe that God's given every one of us a purpose. And I'm going to talk about that in the context of Peter, and I'm going to talk about the idea of a nickname. Each one of you on your forehead has a nickname that really describes who you are. And it's God's print on us. And I believe that some of the stuff we talked about last week, which was the spiritual gift inventory and the motivated gifts inventory, those are the patterns that help us understand our nickname, understand the core gifts that God's given us. If those core gifts define us and drive the way we view ourselves in our roles, particularly in leadership positions in any one of those, then I think the underlying motive and definition of success can begin to become more clear to us. And that's kind of where I started when I went through my crisis a few years ago with the loss of my son. I took a fresh inventory of life. I realized life was too short. I have a 25-year-old son, and like that, he's gone. And I said, let me take an inventory. Did I fail him as a father? Did I invest in him the way I should? Am I investing in the rest of my kids? Am I spending the quality time with my family? And the answer was no. I was at work. 80 hours, not 60. And so I started to say, well, I've been a good dad. Everyone around me said, you're a great father. You were always there when we needed you. You were always at the football games. You were always at the soccer games. You were always at the Boy Scouts. But I wasn't there mentally, because my mind was always grinding on something that was plaguing me at work. So I was present, but I wasn't. So for me, I returned to what God gifted me for. And you know what my primary core gifts are? Coaching. I haven't been coaching my family. I was coaching someone at work. I was using my gift, and probably God had purpose in that. But I had missed the core purpose, and that core purpose was take my gifts and apply it as a leader in my home. And boy, I'll tell you what, when I'm present in my home now, I'm present. And when I'm sitting across the table from one of my adult children and they're looking for guidance, God's using me now, because I'm available. I'm making myself available intentionally. Intentionally. That's what this is about, is what are those primary motivators, and how do you define success? Is it by the latest promotion that we got at work? Or is it really bringing your children, your family in concert with God's purpose? Or bringing that workplace in concert with God's purpose? Martin showed this a few weeks back, and I lay this against the backdrop: do not conform for any longer to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of the mind. That's really what I'm talking about here. And we talked about knowing God's will and His purpose. It's at that root that we're then able to test and approve what God's will is. We begin to really understand at the core level what God wired us to do and what His purpose is. Does that purpose mean that I leave my job? Up to this point, no, not for me. But it does mean that I leave it mentally. That when I shut the car door, leave the parking lot at my workplace, I am gone. And I'm already got my mind on what's going to happen when I walk in my home at night. I've already got my mind on what we're going to do as brothers of Christ in terms of Master's Highway and what we're going to try to do to help others understand this life-changing concept of the cycle of the renewal. It's a transformation that had to happen here, right? It had it now. For me, it was a crisis that brought me to my knees and asked God for help. I prayed that that's not what it takes for everyone. But it really, I was living in this gap. And I didn't understand and approve of what God's will was. In fact, I used to joke I had a Superman cape on. I would go show God what my plans were, ask for His blessing, say thank you very much. I put on my Superman cape and I would soar. And every so often I'd get back to land on the ground, take my Superman cape off and say, God, how'd I do? Do you praise the work? Do you bless the work? And then sometimes I would walk at one of these distances. I would either look at the happiness in my life or the pain and ease with which these accomplishments were made, or I had some idealistic image of leadership. I thought I understood what Christ-like leadership was. And I failed miserably, time and time again. And so these emotions ended up being the core motivators. I was motivated out of the avoidance of these kind of feelings, as opposed to, let me meet God where He is. It may very well be that I've got to get over here. It might be really hard to fulfill God's purpose. He might want me to leave my job. He might be opening new doors for me, and I wasn't even perceiving them. I was ignoring them. He may be talking to me through a friend, and I'm not listening. Or He may be talking to me through a son who needs my help. I'm not listening. So it's really, really key that we dig into what does it mean. In fact, when I first started to read Paul's words, I said, what's this mean to be transformed by the renewing of the mind? I thought this was all about spirituality. But you know what? In fact, remember the model Martin talked about early on, this vertical model that put the mind right in the middle, and we had God at the top. If we put body and flesh at that top, we're going to get all messed up. Well, at the core of this is God wants to change what's going on here. And He does it by changing what's going on here. But if we allow the tape loops to get in the way, or if we allow worldly metrics to drive and motivate us, or worldly metrics to define success, then the mind becomes the roadblock to the transformation. And that's what Paul was talking about. Yes, you can be spiritually transformed. You can, in fact, accept Christ in your life and be saved. That's the beginning of your new life. In order to move into that new life, we've got to change the tape loops that are going on in our head. We've got to change the value propositions that we use that motivate our activity. And we need to move in a direction of His purpose and be present and listening for it. To be sensitive to where God's leading us. Doors closing, doors opening, we're going to talk about at the very end in terms of how we can perceive God moving us and how we can test and approve His will. Let's talk about pitfalls now of these worldly measures of success. So, and there's a long list here. I've only captured a few of them, and you may see in this list your own experiences, or you may say, hey, you forgot one. I got one. If you've got one you want to share, please share. Success is absolute and final. You've heard the word, you put your ladder up against the wrong wall. Anybody heard that in the corporate world? The problem I have with that idea is that we think that walls are permanent, right? We think of a building, its structure, it's solid, and we've leaned our ladder against it, we've climbed the ladder of success. And we get to the top, we're like, oh boy, this is the wrong building. This is the wrong wall. Wrong. Pick up the ladder and move it. Okay? That's what we've been doing. We've been moving our ladders. And where are we climbing? We're climbing towards Him, not towards some worldly metric of what success looks like as a leader. We're reaching on that ladder, rung by rung, leaned against His wall. What's His wall? The purpose He has for us. And that purpose is eternal purpose. It might manifest in the world in different ways. That's why we need to move away from the idea that success is permanent. I've spent 30 years in a career, and now I feel like I've got nothing else to do. I'm the head of my church, and I've done everything that I think God called me to do, and I'm not hearing Him ask me to do anything anymore. And unfortunately, particularly men, we identify so much with our careers and our accomplishments that oftentimes we reach that point where we're at the last rung of that ladder and we feel like it's time to put it away. There's nothing left for me to do. I'll retire and read books or whatever. Or I find I'm against the wrong wall and I realize I wasted 30 years of my career in worldly metrics. And so I feel defeated, or I feel shallow, or I feel unfulfilled.
I was thinking about what was Christ's, what was the pinnacle of His success? The pinnacle of His success was the cross. He died. And so in the world's eyes, He was an abject failure as they stood there and mocked Him and said, boy, if you're the Son of God, come down from there. And so, in other words, and the first will be last, the last will be first, all those paradoxes that we see. And so the comparison of God's metrics of success and our metrics of success usually are completely opposite.
Very different.
So,
yeah.
They're against the wrong
Absolutely.
wall. Right.
Yeah, in fact, I think the key is when we talk about success, we really need to be thinking about as God's eternal purpose, as opposed to the worldly purpose, right? We are living in a phase of eternity. We have our opportunity while we're on this earth to do His purpose, but His purpose extends way beyond their physical presence on this earth. And we tend to forget that when we're caught up in the world, right? Because this is what we know. We're a physical entity right now with a spirit, and we want to connect that spirit with God and then connect this entity with His purpose while we're here. But if we're investing in purpose that's eternal, i.e. God's purpose, then it goes well beyond worldly metrics. It goes well beyond what we can accomplish while we're physically present in some situation.
I would have a tendency to disagree with what you said. I think Christ's pinnacle of success was triumph over death, not the cross.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's a good
Not death,
right.
but life thereafter.
But if you looked at the way he lived as the king of the universe, he lived as a humble. His metrics and the way he lived was completely the opposite of what we strive for and the way we
Oh,
live.
absolutely.
And so that was the comparison I was making. But you're absolutely right. The pinnacle was his triumph of this. Absolutely.
Good point. How many have cravings for something? I happen to crave bagels in the morning. Right? I'm talking about more than bagels. One of the underlying elements of our culture in the United States is this idea of competition and the self-made man, right? And so much of it is about winning and gaining. And we're pressured to do that, particularly when we're not in where we think we should be. You know, I just sat down the other day waiting for my doctor, and I'm reading the Money magazine. It's talking about retirement. I was like, "Wow, this interests me." And everything was about the monetary base you need to establish for your first 6-year retirement. It didn't talk at all about what you're going to do with your discretionary time. Now, it was the Money magazine, right? So you kind of expect that. But what are we craving for? Do we crave Him? Do we crave for a more intimate relationship with Him? Do we wake up in the morning and the first thing we think of is, Lord, thank you? Do we take that time in the morning to spend the peaceful time with Him? And then when we're in that board meeting or we're trying to put up that piece of drywall and we've screwed a nail or hammered a nail in our finger, when we're engaged in the work of the day, is He there? Is He present? Are we craving Him? Are we really craving to get finish the 12-hour day so we can go home? But it's more than that. It's the worldly metrics again. What are we looking for? Are we craving the success, the notoriety? Are we craving the monetary? And in some cases, our success may own us. Some folks crave being in demand. You know, when I was a young man, and I was very active in youth ministry, and because of that, as a young kid, people noticed, so you got a heart for others. So they started asking me to participate in things. First it was Pastor Parish Relations Committee, then it was the Stewardship Committee. I was spiritually mature, and yet these people were asking me to satisfy leadership roles in the church. And you know what I was thinking? Man, am I neat? I'm the youngest kid on the committee. That's not what God wanted. That's not what I should have been craving. I love the fact that everyone at the church wanted me to do something for them. And I was, 22 years old. And everyone was putting me on some kind of pedestal, and I loved it, at least in my mind. That's not a healthy core motive. In fact, God probably had purpose for me on those committees, and I didn't even listen. So I served out of flesh, not out of really an intimate walk with Him and an understanding of what He was trying to do in those situations. Or maybe I should have been listening to Him and say, "You're not ready. Don't take this position. Do not get in a position in the pastor-parish relations where you're making fundamental decisions about the relationship and future of a pastor. You're not suited for that." But I wasn't listening. I talked about this earlier in terms of Christ-likeness. If we're trying to exhibit the character of Christ out of just our own willpower, it's not going to work. So, if we look at our actions, are our actions in concert with Christian values? If they're not, that's pretty much an indication that we're trying to do this out of practice makes perfect. Flesh versus spirit. So we need to, take a step back and say, rather than saying, "I failed again," I was at a meeting the other day and I got angry at someone and I said things I regretted. And in the past, I would have just gone home at night and kicked myself. Instead, I went to that person privately and I said, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. Please forgive me. I was incapable of saying that before. Because I know I'm a child of God and flesh will get in the way. But instead of feeling guilt and remorse and mulling over it and hoping I didn't see that person again, I immediately reach out to him and say, as a brother in Christ, I'm sorry. I was incapable of doing that before. So there are things in terms of the transformation that goes on in our hearts that affect our mind that almost become impulsive after a while. That's good. That's what God wants. That God wants us to be rewired so that we understand we're forgiven and reach to ask for that forgiveness of those around us. Let's talk about Peter. I mentioned I love Peter. I want to talk about and illuminate some things that went on between Peter and Jesus. And I want to put it in the context of a name. When Peter first met Christ, his brother Andrew brought him, right? And he's Simon. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Peter." He stamped the nickname on Peter's forehead. And what I'm going to talk about now is why did he give him that nickname? And how did he use that? I have a friend who nicknames everybody. He calls me the Don because I'm the godfather of his children. That is a huge, huge thing for me. I love it when he calls me Don. It reminds me of my responsibility as a Christian father to his children. So, bing, Peter. So go back to last week about those gifts and the spiritual inventory. What's your nickname? What's your nickname? Let's look at how Christ used Peter's nickname in his relationship with him, particularly in how he was trying to get him to grow as a leader. Someone have their Bible open? I have it here, but read 22 verse 31 to 34. And this is very telling. It's a very good example of how Christ used this nickname. You got it?
My Bible's coming up slowly.
I was going to I've got mine here. I've dumped it in my, okay, go ahead. So verse 31, now this is Christ speaking to Simon, okay? And he's going to reveal something to Simon here, and it's pretty significant. Go ahead.
Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat, but I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers.
Okay, stop. Turn back from what? Peter's probably saying, what are you talking about, turn back?
He's going to sin. He's going to...
That's right. Exactly. In fact, in a moment he's going to tell him he's actually going to deny Christ, right?
3 times.
And what's he calling him at this point in this conversation? Simon. It is from the root of your flesh, Simon, that Satan has asked to sift you, and I have prayed for you, and you will fail me. But when you fail me, you will turn back. Now read on.
What I love is he still calls him rock when he's going to do the opposite.
Exactly, and that's the next sentence.
Okay. But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith, and when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. But he replied, Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death. Jesus answered, I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny 3 times that you know me.
Now, why did he use Peter in that instance when he was telling him he was going to fail him?
Is it a rhetorical question?
No, I have my notion of what the answer is, but I'd like your insight.
I think it's beautiful that this man who goes on to die upside down, crucified, is an example to us. Jesus used him who could break, who could be so strong yet be the other side, polar opposite.
Absolutely. And so at that moment, he goes from Simon, Satan's going to sift through you. I mean, Satan really actually made the request, I'm going to sift through this man. I'm going to draw out his weaknesses. You're going to turn back. In fact, he doesn't say, Simon, you're going to fail me. Simon, you're going to turn back. When you do, I want you to strengthen your brothers. And then he moves to the future, and he talks about Peter. So what is he talking at that point about? He's talking about the Peter whose giftedness is translated not from a fisherman to fulfill the purposes of this world, but from the leader of God's church to fulfill God's purposes and glorify him. It's Peter. That's the nickname. And that had to cut at the core, because Peter felt the same way about his nickname as I feel about my nickname Don. And when my friend doesn't use it, and he doesn't do this to me, but if he were to say, you failed my children, Kev, it wouldn't have, you know, the use of the name would be pretty significant, right? Peter had to feel this. And so the name, for me, when I was given this insight, it illuminated the importance of our own identity. And God gives us the identity that is aligned with his purpose. And I really am passionate about the idea that the root of that identity comes from how he's wired us and how he's gifted us. And if we can align ourselves with understanding his purpose, then he'll use those gifts. I mean, some of Peter's gifts, if we look into these passages, we see Simon as impulsive, ambitious, self-assertive, committed, yet inconsistent. Okay? He was always the first one to say, Lord, I'm here. Tell me what I need to do, right? Right out in front of everybody. But then as soon as he would say, let's go, he would screw it up. That's why I relate to Peter. You know? Yeah, Lord. First one with my hand up. I want to do it. I want to do it, Lord. Okay, well, go. All right, go. Boom. Why? So I'm motivated out of flesh. I'm motivated out of my given name, Kev. Not out of my nickname, Don. My role as the Christian father to my buddy's children is critical. And if I go over there and spend all my time heaping them with worldly concepts, I haven't done them any service, right? Peter's characteristics: committed, consistent, decisive, open-minded, self-denial, humble, and servant leader. If we look into these passages, okay, and in particular, and I'm going to illuminate some of this in a little bit, we start seeing the transformation that happened, and particularly at Pentecost and through the first few books of Acts, when we see Peter engaging as the leader of the church, giving a sermon and winning over the community, speaking to the Sanhedrin, healing a beggar. And then later, in terms of open-mindedness, he even turns around the notion that you have to become a Jew before you can become a Christian, right? He gets the dream, goes to see Cornelius. That was tough for him. All the rest of the apostles were saying, time out. What are you doing? You've got to convert to Judaism before you can convert to Christianity. That's a rule, man. And so Peter's closed-mindedness was replaced by humility, by open-mindedness. God sent him a dream, right? The blanket with all the stuff that would be bad to eat if I was a Jew. When we look in 1 Peter, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, we see the servant in his message to the early Christians as to how to lead by serving. So let's talk about it. Would someone read, was that the one we already read, 21?
Yeah, no, 22.
So let's move to verse 21, 15 to 19.
Chapter 21?
I'm sorry, yeah. John chapter 21. Verse 15. This is by the Sea of Tiberias. Paul has jumped out of the water. You know, he figured out that this was Christ on the shore. They heave up all these nets and there's all these fish. So Peter impulsively jumps out of the boat and swims to shore, leaving all the other buddies, his fishing buddies, to haul all the fish. So here he is, acting on his impulse. Well, you know what? That's a gift. God gifted him with impulsive behavior. What he had to learn was moderation and follow-through and commitment. So go ahead and read 15 to 19.
When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him a third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. I tell you the truth, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me."
So there are a few things I want to draw out of what we just heard and what transpired on the shore. First of all, it's obvious that this parallels the denial. He asked him 3 times. He denied him 3 times. It parallels the denial and is bringing to the mental and spiritual within Peter, brings to that surface again the sorrow and guilt he must have felt at that critical moment when a servant girl challenged him. Not the Sanhedrin, not the spiritual leaders of the church, not the political leaders of their time, a servant girl. He failed. He said, "I want to do this, God. I'm right there with you. I'm going to wait outside the gate. While I'm here, I'm going to witness." And the servant girl pulls the rug right out in front of him. So that had to have brought all that back. He's excited. He's jumped into the water and swum across the shore, and he's sitting on the shoreline with his brothers in Christ, sitting there with their teacher, eating breakfast. And what does he get reminded of? Boy, would that be a suck in the gut, right? He uses his name Simon Peter initially, Simon Peter. He reminds him of both his worldly and his spiritual nicknames. Why? He needs to meet him where he is. He needs to start with Simon and finish with Peter. So he's meeting him emotionally and spiritually where he was at that moment. He impulsively jumped out of the boat and swam over to the shore, and he's excited about seeing his Savior. But he's not there mentally and spiritually yet. He's excited about the moment. But Christ could walk away in an instant, and Jesus and Peter would go back to fishing. I mean, after all, he went back to his business. He went back to the business of living. He was a successful businessman of his time. And what did he find himself doing? Fishing. Where did Christ have to meet him? Where he was. So he's using the human and the spiritual name to get Peter right where he needed him, not only spiritually but mentally. He was where he needed to be spiritually, but mentally he wasn't there. Now, we miss in the English translation the significance of those 3 questions and the 3 responses. Jesus asks him, "Do you love me with agape love?" 3 times he asks him that. Okay? Do you love me with agape love? In fact, maybe the 3rd time he might have said phileo love.
Yeah, I think he did.
I think he did.
Yeah.
And Peter each time responded, "I love you." Phileo love is, I love you as a brother with deeply felt affection for you and a strong desire to act. That's the definition of phileo love. Peter could not, in his flesh, answer the question that he knew Christ was asking him. And I think in the last time, Christ actually changed to, "All right, I'll meet you where you are. Do you love me like a brother? And are you prepared? Do you have the affection, and are you prepared and have a strong desire to act?" He affirmed that strength of his conviction. But at that point, Peter was unable to act out of flesh. He really needed Peter to move spiritually and mentally, to be renewed and transformed into the leader of his church. And so 3 times he said, "Feed my sheep and follow me." He didn't say, "Go proselytize, go run my church, go heal the sick."